Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Balalovsky. I'm a partner in the Business Services Division of BDO in Sydney. Welcome to our presentation titled Growth in a Time of Pandemic, International Trade and Business Opportunities. In contemplating this session and in formulating this session, we thought to ourselves, there are a lot of presentations that are freely available, it would seem, from various sources with regard to the panic that's surrounding the globe with regard to, of course, the coronavirus. And rightly so, there is a lot of uncertainty, there is a lot of doubt, there is a lot of fear, especially in business, trade and commerce. But our point of differentiation really was to offer some form of support or advice with regard to, well, what to do in these circumstances in a global context. That is, if you are already operating in a global context or are contemplating operating in a global context. We felt that there wasn't enough with regard to solutions that are being offered, merely only statements or recitals of the mere fact that everyone is uncertain and everyone is unafraid. That's certainly true, but we hope that what we can do in the next hour is give you some insights and some assistance and some recommendations for what you possibly could do. And the context of this as well is that there are some growth environments, the disruptions, the shifts in technology, the changes in processes and laws offer some growth opportunities environments that are probably emerging in areas that are traditionally not considered by most Australian businesses. In particular, we are very pleased to welcome Mr Aleksander Mladenovski, who is the CEO of North Macedonia's free zones, who will provide a specific insight into one of those growth environments that we particularly like, and that is the benefits of establishing your operations in North Macedonia. Now, just some housekeeping issues, if I can, before getting into the presentation proper. You'll have the opportunity to submit your questions in the question pane that you see in the on the platform in front of you. We'll respond to the questions via email after the session concludes if we can't do everything during the presentation. We'll try as much as possible to answer those questions that are relevant during the presentation, of course. And Alex has already indicated that he's happy to take those questions during his presentation. I'll moderate those and I'll make sure that the appropriate ones go through to him if we can get them in. The slides will also be made available to you after the session today. And if you've got any technical difficulties, click support or visit the link that you've got on your screen there. After the session, as I mentioned, you'll get the slides, you'll get a link to the recorded session, access to past and future webinars from BDO, and also the contact details of all of the presenters. So the agenda for the next 60 minutes or so is that I will give a bit of background and context to this session, and my segment, unfortunately, is the doom and gloom session. I'll try and be as upbeat as I possibly can, but unfortunately, much like many of the other presentations, I'll be repeating a lot of the obvious, but it's necessary for the context and the Australian context, the Australian economic context, especially with regard to manufacturing and exports. I'll be followed by Bill Cole, who's a partner BDO, and I'll give his full bio in just a moment. And he'll deal specifically with customs, taxes and tariffs in the international context, and some better news for you there than what I'll be able to deliver. And then to the keynote presenter, Alex Mladenovski, CEO Technical Industrial Development Zones, North Macedonia, with a case study of North Macedonia. And he'll be talking about the advantages and positives of investing in that environment, in that jurisdiction. And if we have time, there'll be an open forum where you'll be able to ask your questions rather than during the presentation. So if I can, setting the context, the Australian economic conditions and outlook. Well, the federal budget that we saw, delayed Australian annual federal budget that was released this month, last week, shows the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Australia's economy. It was always going to be the case. It's very well known to us that the Australian federal government has provided economic support for workers, households, businesses, and it's nudging $300 billion, or the equivalent of approximately 15% of the Australian gross domestic product. A huge expenditure, unprecedented, of course. In this context, there are forecast declines in taxation receipts of over $63 billion in the current financial year. When I first started my career, and I started my career in the Australian Public Service, in the Australian Taxation Office, and that was the annual collection figure in the mid to later 1980s of Australian revenue. And now we're talking about that being the hit to taxation revenues in one financial year, and essentially perhaps just during 9 months, 3/4 of that financial year. So that is a significant impact on the Australian finances. The underlying cash balance is also forecast to decrease from balance, and that was last year in 2018-19, to a $213.7 billion deficit at the end of the current financial year. Again, eye-watering, staggering numbers. It'll probably take several generations for that to be brought back into balance, but that is the number. The debt levels have increased significantly, obviously, as well, although Australia still continues to have a low level of debt to GDP compared to other OECD countries and most of the rest of the world, for that matter as well. Australia's net debt is expected to increase to $703 billion, and that's over 36% of GDP at the end of this financial year. And at the same time, real GDP is predicted to fall by 1.5%. Now, that's a stunning turnaround from some of the figures that were projected 6 months ago. It was 7+% real GDP predicted falls, and we've managed to pull that back at present, if Treasury figures can be relied on, probably one of the best sources, of course, to fall by a mere 1.5% in 2021. During the past 7 months or so, over 700,000 Australian jobs have been lost. Sorry, that was in the June quarter. The unemployment rate is forecast to peak at around 7.25% in 2021, which again is a pullback from some of the figures previously, which were nudging 10%. In the Federal Treasurer's own words, the economic and fiscal outlook remains highly uncertain, and that's stating the bleeding obvious. Nevertheless, the bottom line there that I've mentioned is that the structural integrity of the budget seems intact. And in fact, all 3 major credit rating agencies have reaffirmed Australia's AAA credit rating during the pandemic. That may change, but the news seems to be good, in fact, for Australia, considering, all things considering. So I said I was going to be a bit gloomy, but hopefully not too gloomy with that final point. This session, of course, is focusing on international issues for Australian businesses. And that, of course, will focus on, or an important component of that is, of course, exports. Now, exports during the same period of goods and services, Australian exports of goods and services, tumbled 4% to around $34.5 billion in July 2020. That was represented by a fall in agricultural goods of 15%. Non-agricultural goods, better news, only fell by 6%, and that was led by metals, and that's no surprises in Australia, minus 20%, and mineral fuels, 18%. Exports of services, and we're trying to be a more service-orientated economy, and that's an important part of this presentation with respect to, are we a manufacturing economy? Have we given up on manufacturing? But exports of services in the same period dropped 12%, particularly due to tourism-related services, and that suffered a 20% fall. But we can see in that second graph that the long-term trend is growth, which is expected, I suppose, given the outward orientation of Australian economic policies of all governments, of all persuasions, for around 3 decades in Australia. Long-term growth in exports. And that blip at the end, I think, is well and truly expected. So to manufacturing then, and we can see here as well that in July this year, so for the most recent or relevant period relating to COVID issues, Australian exports of manufactured goods decreased to just over $1 billion in the month of July, from $1.25 billion in June. So it is definitely suffered a dramatic hit, somewhere around 25% hit. However, if we look at the graph below, excluding pandemic times, we seem to be fairly consistent at approximately $1.5 billion per month in exports of manufactured goods as a nation. Although you should be able to see there from that graph as well, the bottom graph, is that the strong growth of the 1990s has plateaued. And that's where we're at from the 1990s onwards, at about that average of $1.5 billion per month in manufactured goods. An interesting statistic is that manufactured goods currently represent about 3% of all Australian exports, only 3% of Australian exports, compared to 9% in 2007. In earlier decades, that figure was, of course, higher. And it's a recurring theme in this presentation is that the manufacturing sector, and again, I'm stating what seems to be the bleeding obvious, seems to be in decline in Australia. So what to do in that context? And it seems natural for most Australians and Australian businesses to turn to the government for an answer and a solution. The 2021 budget, federal budget, included an investment of $1.5 billion over 4 years for what's known as the Modern Manufacturing Strategy. And that's to allow Australian manufacturers to scale up, to compete internationally and to create more jobs, according to the speak from the Treasurer. The centrepiece of the strategy is $1.3 billion for what's known as the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. And that's going to support projects within 6 national manufacturing priorities. Now, this is probably a positive step. I don't want to rubbish that entirely. $1.5 billion over 4 years is very, very welcome. And it should go away to securing Australia's future growth in manufacturing. It seems to target support to better commercialise manufacturers' operations, to help them enter new export markets, and to innovate through collaboration between government, research institutions and the industry. But I'll go on the public record as saying that $1.5 billion over 4 years for a middle economy such as Australia that wants to pull itself out of some of those graphs that I've indicated where manufacturing exports are in decline and manufacturing exports as a percentage of overall GDP are in decline, $1.5 billion over 4 years probably doesn't cut it, probably isn't going to achieve the objective. And it's not just a matter of money as well, in my view. It probably needs to be overall policy. And what is that policy? I think it might be fair to also say that the federal government has no single specific overarching manufacturing policy. There's no doubt that manufacturing is a consideration in several of its strategies for the future, a program known as Strategies for the Future, and they include artificial intelligence, innovation and science, but perhaps most relevantly for this group today is what's known as the Industry Growth Centres. Within the government's Industry Growth Centres, there is the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre. And that is exactly what it sounds like. It's intended to facilitate advanced manufacturing by Australian enterprises, irrespective of where that might occur. Now, this is driving cultural change. It increases competitiveness, unlocks new commercial opportunities, and fosters innovation. One thing that I think, though, might be very important to take from this growth centre, Australian Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, is that it's not about handouts. It's not about bailouts in the way that Australia might have operated post-war initially with some heavy manufacturing, auto manufacturing in particular. It's much more about self-help. It's much more about indirect financial support from the government so that industry can innovate and find its own way of getting to export markets. The era of handouts, bailouts, and safety nets well and truly appears to be over. The last dot point on my slide, and before I hand over to Bill, is that the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre itself advocates that an important element of resilience is cost flexibility. And that goes to the very point of Bill's presentation right now and Alex's presentation, cost flexibility in this context. So with that, I'd like to now introduce you to, and I'll just get a little bit of his details here just a moment, to Bill, my colleague Bill. And Bill is a partner in our Melbourne office in international trade. He's experienced in government, industry, and consulting. He's an international trade expert with a history of delivering successful outcomes for businesses in the international trade sphere. Bill Cole.
Thank you, Chris. Slide, please, Kate. So, one back, please. So when Chris labelled himself the bearer of the bad news, I must confess that I'm going to give you a little bit of that before I move into solution mode. The times that we're living in terms of international trade have probably not been as disrupted and as uncertain, certainly in my career for probably 30 years. What you're seeing, of course, is just a collage of the press that issues and difficulties in international trade has been receiving. These were put together mid last year, but the ideas have continued on into the COVID era. So between political security and pandemic issues, the international trading environment is probably more difficult now than it's ever been. This has been reflected in numerous surveys, I suppose you'd call them, of C-suite executives, CFOs, CEOs around the world who have elevated trade and supply chain security into the top 3 areas of concern for their growth considerations going forward in the coming decade. So the starting point is one of increased difficulty. The second layer is, of course, the idea that in current times, with depressed economies generally around the world due to disease and/or other economic suppression, the role of trade as an engine of growth and as a means of businesses gaining global scale and economic prominence is undoubted, but it's quite frankly more difficult now than it's ever been. And this, you'll see later, has some impacts on business choices when entering into the international trade environment. Slide, please. The map's one of my favorite maps. It's pretty old now. It's about 15 years old, but those little yellow dots was I think a 5-second window in 2003, where all the ships on the water globally were identified. And as you can see, there's some very heavy lines, north, south, east, west. That, ladies and gentlemen, is international trade in its real form. It's boats with things going between countries. And my overlays just serve to show that some of the existing issues in international trade sit right over the top of some of those thickest lines, the densest supply chain routes for international trade. The issues around Brexit and other and the WTO around Europe, the Straits of Hormuz, difficulties with Iran, and the passage of energy-laden tankers through the straits, coronavirus in the what at the time was the Asia-Pacific region, but clearly spread all around the world, and of course the US, China, and others engaged in trade wars as the other significant hot zone for consideration. Slide, please. Not all of the movements in international trade, of course, have been bad ones. Prior to COVID, there were some significant gains in international trade, despite the security and the trade wars that I've mentioned. For instance, in 2019, global trade reached again its pre-GFC levels. So it had taken something like 10 years to do it, but trade was back to its very, very significant levels prior to the global financial crisis. In global trends, in terms of rules-based trade, the number of trading agreements were increasing. 420 at, I think that was November 2019. And the significance of that is, of course, that more and more countries were creating secure rules-based arrangements between themselves and trading partners in order to create cost and logistics efficiencies for the movement of goods and other forms of trade. And this, of course, has been the basis of a lot of the wealth in this century. Positive trade growth was forecast for 2020 before the COVID-19 outbreak, but the point was that the trend was a good one. Moving into, I suppose, more contemporary issues, most governments, certainly in the developed world, were allocating significant resources to rebuilding manufacturing capability and other productive capability through the reshoring and localization of manufacturing. That's good for trade in the sense that as much as it may be a challenge to the movement of final goods, it certainly encouraged the movement of intermediate goods and inputs to manufacture. And finally, as an offshoot of that reshoring and localization sets of policies, governments were pouring support in for key industries, again requiring materials, machinery that ultimately is derived from international trade. On the flip side, however, as I said earlier, CEOs are deeply concerned about supply chains, their efficiency, their cost, and their security. And if there was one outstanding feature, I suppose, of the last 15 to 20 months, it's been a focus on the reliability of being able to send a good from A to B in reasonable time at reasonable cost. In Australia, of course, supply chain costs are significant and constantly endanger margins realised by exporters. Not to even talk about the ideas of efficiency. Globally, given the security issues that I identified on that map that you saw, supply chain security has become a significant issue also. All of these things go to cost and speed to market. The next point down, global trade rules are under pressure. The World Trade Organization is beset with disagreements among its major supporters. The US, of course, is a prominent one, but not the only one. And the significance of the global rules being questioned is that it brings uncertainty into individual arrangements between countries. We see in anti-dumping and some of the other mechanisms of trade enforcement that there is increasing divergence between countries in terms of how they interpret trade rules, and that's unfortunate for certainty among businesses. The US-China trade war has had significant spillover effects to businesses that are not China-based. The US actions around invoking barriers for Chinese goods also applied to goods that weren't from China. So the current US regime's implementation of strategies to bring back manufacturing and to divert trade from China has caused unintended consequences in other countries. Australia, for instance, in automotive parts was affected by the US-China trade barriers because they're blunt instruments, quite frankly. And a lot of effort has gone on in other countries to try and claim a special case under the trade war arrangements. Freedom of navigation, Brexit, and coronavirus, of course, are all well known to you as observers of international affairs. All of them are disruptive. Coronavirus, of course, has disrupted not only individuals and domestic economies, but also international supply chains. It's slowed down the movement of sea freight goods. It paralyzed for a long time the movement of air freight goods, on the basis that most of the cargo shipped out of Australia, for instance, was in the belly of passenger aircraft. They, of course, have been closed down. Fortunately, dedicated freighters have overtaken and picked up a lot of that slack, but nevertheless, the weakness has been shown. And finally, summing all of this up, business confidence and trade uncertainty is suppressing trade generally. Slide, please. So that's a setting, and as I've said to you, it's good and bad. Underneath that layer, of course, are the what I'll call the wheels and cogs of international trade. And if we put the layer of supply chain security and the presence or otherwise of trade agreements, et cetera, as a top layer, underneath that operates, if you like, the business operative issues. Trade being a cross-border activity, of course, immediately causes us to deal with borders, and borders and international trade generally is regulated. So countries have administrations of the borders, as you well know. Customs is one of the key authorities that deals with that, and typically their activities center around the levying of revenue and the control of goods moving to and fro. One of the key aspects of the formula, of the considerations around businesses, and in particular manufacturing businesses in moving goods from their place of manufacture to a destination market, relate to border taxes and duties. It's reasonable to say that in terms of first world trade, duty rates in the EU, Asia, and North American regions usually range between 2 and 20% of the price of the goods. Last time I looked, average margin or average return on investment in manufacturing sat between about 3 and 5%. So even 2% is a significant amount of money. 20%, of course, is an extraordinary extraordinary impost and an extraordinary inflation of landed cost. So duties are still significant, and as much as we've got various means of mitigating those duties, the fact is that on the books, without further mediation, there are significant barriers to trade remaining at the customs barrier at the border. Supply chain costs without security and other what I'll call disruptive issues is also a significant cost. So most of the Asian supply chains that I see and deal with can reach up to 7% of price. So that's an extra add-on to the cost of goods for moving it before you get to a border. When we talk about landed cost, we talk about the price of the goods, the price of moving the goods, the price or the cost rather of the duty and border taxes and the transportation to the point of transfer between buyer and seller. That's the total cost that exporters have to compete with. And of course, anything that minimizes these amounts goes to margin. The final point is that in a time of uncertainty and disruption, current trends are showing an increase in costs and barriers. So as much as the trading world has the World Trade Organization rules and various other means of facilitating trade, in times of uncertainty and in trade disruption between countries, barriers come up, costs increase. And all of these, of course, are disincentives. In terms of mitigating these factors, as I said on the earlier slide, there are significant numbers of agreements between countries which seek to reduce cost and delays for traded goods. The fact is, though, that of those 420 agreements, not everybody has an agreement with the countries that they want to trade with. Not every country has in their agreements the rules and regulations that significantly reduce cost or in some way facilitate goods. So they're not the total solution. A lot of them are interesting and very encouraging beginnings to more integrated economic behaviors, but they are not ends in themselves. The supply chain uncertainty and costs, especially in this COVID environment, require significant planning and information and reappraisal, I suppose, of business activities. To use particular supply chains now with certainty is a significant planning and I suppose coordination activity. Previously, it was happily put in the hands of service providers who would undertake to try and get goods to a particular place in a particular condition at a particular time. Obviously, modern contracts and business requirements need much more precision than that. In times of uncertainty, the supply chain needs to be a significant focus of business on the basis of the export supply model that you've chosen. One of the other aspects, I suppose, that overcomes some of the border issues that are commonly gone up against by exporters is producing to global rather than domestic standards. Some of the barriers to trade relate to not so much the products themselves, but whether they are of a particular quality, whether they have particular labeling, whether they are of a particular material, or whether they are recyclable even in this time of sustainable production. So the standards that apply in a particular market certainly influence the ability of products to access that market. The last two really relate to commercial arrangements. I've really been speaking about production and regulatory issues up to now, but a very, very significant issue in trying to mitigate cost and risk in international trade comes down to what deal can you cut with your with the buyer of your goods. Who will take control of the goods at the port? Who will do the clearances for customs purposes? Who will assume risk at a particular point where insurance ends? These are all very, very important considerations in terms of the broader uncertain environment. Slide, please. And all of those factors really start on the basis of a model of trade. Now, up to now, we've been talking mainly about the movement of a good between a country for the purpose of sale. There are other models, which I've called in this diagram in situ models, which means that the manufacturer in Australia doesn't just send final goods across a border for some form of distribution and sale in another country, but they actually engage in production offshore, closer to the market. But we'll go through the different models. So the first three in the import, export, import, sale models are really about low margin sales with low risk arrangements with a buyer. All of these, buyer responsible for goods at your factory, buyer responsible for goods at your port, buyer responsible for goods at the destination port, all minimize the risk of the seller. But what they also do is prevent what they all do is reduce the ability of the seller to go up the supply chain and improve market presence and margin in selling their goods in a foreign country. So yes, you can reduce risk. The least risky approach is for the buyer to come to your factory, buy the goods and disappear. That's great. But you're never going to make the potential profits that are available in the foreign country of distribution. And it's quite common in some of our agricultural products that you're buying agents collecting the goods at the gate, farmer's gate, and by the time they get to the consumer in the destination country, they've been marked up 400 or 500 times. And that is because the seller does not have control or access to the supply chains in a foreign country. The next group in green are examples of where the seller has taken on more risk to bring goods closer to the buyer in the destination country. The final one being, of course, the seller having taken responsibility of clearance in a foreign country and the transportation of goods to the buyer's premises. So, of course, for all these risks, there are extra costs which have to be incorporated into the price of the goods, and also extra margin, albeit not the margin that you get when you finally sell the goods in that destination country. The interesting one, and the red and the green options are the typical models, probably points 1 to 4 are the most common for Australian exports of all commodities, let alone manufactured ones. 5 and 6 are more rare. The interesting ones for me, though, and the ones that will segue, I think, into Alex's presentation are what I call the in situ production. So the seller can go further into the foreign distribution channels and actually produce goods in countries that are adjacent to a prime market. We'll use the example of the EU. The seller can produce in countries like Morocco or places like that and sell into the prime markets. Those kinds of models are very good in terms of minimizing supply chain risk and achieving very, very efficient distribution and inventory controls, but you still have the issues of often of border taxes and duties. Option 2 of the in situ production, seller produces in countries with agreements with the prime market. So once again, The model is one where there are excellent supply chain outcomes due to proximity to the main market of sale, and the manufacturer has set up in a country that actually has trade agreements with the prime market. Now, the significance of that, of course, is that to produce in a country with agreements with the prime market means that you take on the origin of that country for your goods. You can build to standard, and you can potentially avoid the duties and taxes as a result of having that country of production having free trade agreements with the prime market. The final model, and probably the best of these, is where a seller produces in a special zone in a country adjacent to the prime market that also has agreements with the prime market. So what are the special zones? There's plenty of them in Asia. They're called free trade zones. The model is that manufacturers and or distributors can set up in these zones in a duty and tax-free environment. They can usually produce goods to whatever level of value add. The goods can be released into the consumption of the market where the free trade zone is, or taken from that market into a prime market. The good thing about these zones, there's plenty of them in the Persian Gulf too, is that there are often significant incentives for being there. The in-situ production models have particular requirements that trading goods doesn't, and that is that often you are incorporated as an entity into those countries. In many examples, that means that you have to report for taxation purposes, and you are drawn into the domestic taxation system. In special zones, often you have tax and other incorporation breaks, which give you tax holidays effectively. So the interesting piece in this environment is whether or not these special zones offer sufficient incentives in terms of low taxation, zero customs and border taxes, and low supply chain costs sufficiently well for them to be an attractive alternative to moving goods, for instance, from Australia to a particular market. The key issues then, of course, is margin maintenance, achieving volume, access and control around the goods and the supply chain, and the presence or otherwise of establishment and other costs from being, if you like, resident in other countries. Slide, please. In summary, regardless of whether you export or stay as a domestic business, you have to make a number of similar decisions. You have to decide on what your market is, what revenues you need, what scale you'll achieve. And offshoring and or exporting provides you with a revenue and scale model, as well as a market model, in a similar fashion, albeit with different elements. In the manufacturing sector, for instance, businesses need to seek either high value or high volume, or both, markets for growth, particularly in the Australian environment, where we have a low population and a low industrial base. The EU, Asia, and North America represent obvious choices for market entry for Australian manufacturing, given that they require a degree of sophistication and IP-rich items for consumption or inputs to manufacture. And increasingly, the localization and procurement policies of governments at the moment favour full or partial value adding in or near target markets. So there's a clear trend or a clear preference in target markets to have some local content. So a range of choices there, and I will now hand over to Alex, who will give us a particular example of some of these models.
Hello, good morning to me, good afternoon to you. Well, basically, what we represent, we're the Free Zones Authority of the Republic of North Macedonia. What we do is we developed industrial zones in order for manufacturing to enter the country, and we are completely ready to support them with everything. Slide, please. Okay, why North Macedonia? It's a competitive location, excellent infrastructure, competitive workforce, investment incentives, investor-friendly government. Slide, please. Where Macedonia is located. Macedonia is located in the southeastern part of Europe, right above Greece. We have two international airports, one of them being Skopje, the other one being Ohrid. We have two international ports, which are in the 300-kilometer radius, one of them being Thessalonica, another one being Durrës. In the 600-kilometer range from the country, there is additional three ports, one of them being Burgas in Greece, Piraeus in Athens, and Bor in Montenegro. Slide, please. Macroeconomic indicators. This slide hasn't been updated. Unfortunately, our actual projected growth was supposed to be 3.8 this year. We're going to end it with a minus 3.8. However, all the other parameters stayed stable. FDI as a percentage of GDP, it's now even revised and it's higher than what's shown on over there. We have low inflation rates, less than 2% annually. Macedonia, the dinar is pledged to the euro, so it never loses value. It's 61.5 dinars. Currently, the average gross monthly salary for the 2019 was 609 euros per month and 508 euros per in manufacturing. Slide, please. We have stable credit ratings, budget deficit of about 1.8% of GDP. This year, it's going to be much higher. We have free trade agreements with all European Union nations, with the EFTA countries, CEFTA countries, which are the local countries around here, and bilateral free trade agreements. 650 million customers. Throughout the years, we have been ranked really high on the World Business, on the World Bank Doing Business report. As you can see, we have went from way down there in 2006, where we are 10th in 2000, and we're 10th in 2019, 4th in Europe, #1 in Eastern Europe for ease of doing business report, for ease of doing business. Slide, please. Operation costs and taxes. Slide, please. Average monthly salary in the CE countries, Central and Eastern European countries, basically, we have the lowest gross average monthly salary. And you can compare on this slide with Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia and Montenegro, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Poland, Croatia, Czech Republic, and Slovenia. We look at them as kind of our competitors. Slide, please. Social Security contributions. The Social Security contributions in our country are at 28%, which means, and as you can see, all the countries underneath area has a little bit lower Social Security contributions, whereas all the countries in the region are much higher security contributions compensation. Slide, please. A breakdown of a monthly gross average salary eligible for subsidies by the government. Basically, what you see here is a breakdown of a salary. The employee would get 354 of the income tax. Slide, please. Gross average monthly salary, average gross monthly salary increase in manufacturing throughout the years. Basically, it has been stable throughout years. The growth has been somewhere in the 2 to 4%, which is basically just above the inflation rate. Slide, please. The rankings we have gotten from international media and so on and so forth, people that do the ratings, as you can see in the bottom of the slide, the judging criteria is quite wide on how this was judged. So for top 10 small European cities, cost effectiveness, Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia, has been ranked #1 throughout the years. As future cities and regions. Then for cost effectiveness, we have, as well as for in the small and micro cities, we have steep Prilep as well, ranking way high up there by the Financial Times. Slide, please. Excellent infrastructure, as I said, complete transportation costs. In Macedonia, we have all the international big logistics players operating. Transportation by truck, you reach anywhere in Europe 2 to 3 days by truck. As I said before, there is 2 international ports, one of them being Thessaloniki, which is pretty much 2.5 hours drive from here. We're connected to the pan-European corridor 2018. 2 new highways under construction, new railway connection to Bulgaria is coming up next year. Slide, please. Labor availability, slide, please. pretty much our population is a really young population. 40% of our population is under the age of 30. We have investment of about 60 million euros every year in 200 laboratories and technical universities. 6% of our GDP is spent on education. We have about 60,000 students that enroll in university, about 10,000 graduates each year. Slide, please. We have throughout the country, the vocational schools are spread out throughout the country. Main universities and university centers would be Skopje, Štip, and Bitola in the south, as well as Prilep. However, there are now it's all spread throughout the country, so pretty much you can find a stable labor pool whenever you choose to be in the country. Slide, please. Dual vocational training programs with all the investors that are coming up with the manufacturing on the manufacturing side in the country. We have established collaboration with those students that go to those vocational schools, get their they get part of the schooling in the factories and part of the schooling in the school. So once they graduate from the vocational school, they can get they are really ready to work at the factories that are working in the zones. Slide, please. Most recent greenfield investors in our sites, we have Johnson Matthey, which is a British company, and as you can see, the flag next to the company is where they come from. These are all manufacturing sites, of course. Johnson Matthey, we have American Dura and Aptiv, and this is only in Skopje zone. We have Van Hool here producing buses, Chemet electrical capacitors, Vitillo from Italy, they do high pressure hosing. Gerresheimer does medical devices, Baumer does sensors. Hightech is a Macedonian company that produces PCB boards. Kessler is an R&D center. We have Murat and Chagate, which are in the cable industry. Diatec and ARC, they're automotive both. Slide, please. Throughout the country, in the other zones, we have Kiel here from Germany, Liar from the United States, that's in the Tetovo zone, Makart as well, it's outside the zones in Veles. We have Amphenol, Technical Textiles, Kondevo, Adient, which are in the Štip zone. Strumica zone, we have Adient, we have Drexelmeier and Robert Schubert here, automotive manufacturing, Vika plus and get the Prilep zone. Then Odeve, Kostal, and Joyson are in the Kičevo-Ohrid region. Slide, please. As far as the zones are concerned, I will go a little bit more in depth with the zones. We have gotten many awards throughout the years, as you can see on this slide, from the Financial Times and FDI Intelligence magazine. Slide, please. As well as there are some ratings by Site Selection magazine. We were ranked number 4 in the world for business friendliness, and then we ranked number 2 on the top 20 zones by projects, capex, and job per capita last year as well. Slide, please. We have 8 zones or 8 operational zones on 7 locations in the country. One of them being next to the capital, which is Skopje Zone 1 and 2. We have free zone of Štip to the right, which is in the central part of the country. In the southern part of the country, we have Strumica and Prilep zones, as well as Struga and Kičevo zones, which would be in the west part of the country. We have Tetovo zone, which is a public-private partnership. Infrastructure benefits of the zones. There is electrical grid outlet in every zone, telecommunications network, light, fire, safety systems, security monitoring, water and sewage network are provided, as well as Skopje 1 and 2 are fully gasified. Slide, please. Fiscal benefits, basically what we do, of any manufacturing site that comes in and decides to invest in the zones, we subsidize 50% of its investment. What that means is there is exemption of taxes of up to 10 years, and I'll explain how it goes. As well as there is no tariffs or customs duties on all the equipment wherever it comes from in the world. Connection and complete infrastructure is available, as I mentioned. No municipal utility tax, custom outposts in every zone, so everything that's manufactured goes through the green channel outside the country. We have 10% return on investments on costs of new machinery and equipment and buildings. What are built in the zones? €1 a square meter a year, it's on lease basis, and there are certain job creation grants. Basically, how the incentives work. Let's take an investment of in a manufacturing site, inclusive of machines and construction of the actual plant. It takes 10 million euros. The subsidies of the government will be a portion of 5 million euros. 20 of them would be in cash grants and job creation grants. And the rest of the 30% that are left to the 50% of the 5 million euros in this case, would be in tax incentives up to 10 years. So you'll be either exempt from paying all taxes for 10 years or until you reach 50% of your investment. Slide, please. What the Free Zones Authority does in the country, basically we are a full service to any manufacturing investment. From the initial stage where we meet with an investor, throughout their location, whatever they need to do in the country, we are a one-stop shop for all their needs. Furthermore, they have no other bureaucratic institutions that have to go through. All the contracts and everything is taken care of by our authority. We issue all the building permits, we do everything, and then when they start manufacturing and everything, we are the one-stop shop for them to help them if they need to meet the customs official, a government official, they have some kind of problem with some of the raw materials, anything they may need as an aftercare. We have a whole aftercare department that takes care of all the needs. So we are a complete full service for all the investors in the zones. Slide, please. With the picture of our beautiful Ohrid in the southwestern part in the country, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very much. There are a couple of questions that have come through. The first is with regard to customs duty and taxes. And it's very clear that there's a potential 10-year tax-free holiday for those operating in the zones, but it's limited to 10 years. With the potential for zero customs duty for those operating in the zones, is there a time limit there as well?
For the customs, well, it depends where because they're exempt customs on equipment and machines.
Mm-hmm.
However, on the raw materials, there will be customs from the get-go if the raw materials are from are outside of, it depends on our schedule of tariffs. However, if it comes from a third countries other than European and the ones that we have free trade agreements with.
Okay. Okay. So so potential customs holidays there as well, unlimited in time. And the second question that's come through is with regard to political stability as well. And the question that's arisen, North Macedonia is not part of the European Union today, but there are proposed accession negotiations commencing in November. How likely is European Union membership and when?
Well, we just joined NATO last year. And this year in March, it was a complete, we finished the process of joining NATO. So pretty much the country is stable in a sense of its borders, in a sense of international security. As far as the EU goes, we're supposed to start the accession negotiations, as you said, by the end of this year. Those are going to be for quite a while. It takes a couple of years to join the EU. However, politically we have been quite stable. There is no reason to think about any political problems anytime soon, or ever, in that sense.
Okay. Very good. All right. Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. I thank both of our speakers very much. As I said at the outset, in very troubling, very uncertain, very confusing times, my part of the presentation reiterated that message, but tried to offer some light and assistance. Bill addressed some very specific strategies and solutions, particularly with regard to pros and cons of international trade, and a very clear balancing of the ledger with regard to some issues. And then, of course, Alex's presentation painting a very rosy picture for one of the international solutions that are available. And as Alex has indicated, his office is open to questions and for assistance at any time, as are we, Bill and myself, and BDO more broadly. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you very much for your questions, and we hope to speak to you all again very shortly.
Thank you.